As was just said, my name is John. I'm an artist, a researcher, and a museologist. And I'm here to talk to you today about my Museum of Portable Sound and its relationship to what I'm calling a paleonomy of the sound object within museology. My interest in this topic has been going on for several years, ever since I tried to find a museum that had a sound archive at which I could do an internship for the museum studies program I was in at a previous institution. And as I was asking around to different museums, they kept telling me that they don't collect sound, they collect objects. And that totally makes sense, especially when you consider that until recently, it was almost universally accepted that museums are silent, purely visual experiences. And forgive the language of the image that's up there. I just took that in the city center yesterday. It's a great museum. It's the Women's Museum of Denmark. If you're not from around here, definitely go. It's an awesome place, and that banner is amazing. Anyway, André Malraux, the mid-20th century French theorist and art historian, was an expert in what we would now refer to as visual culture. And he suggested that museums were so purely visual that since high-quality reproduction of photographs had become so affordable and widespread at the time of writing, which was between the 40s and the 50s, that museums ought to be replaced by books, and he referred to this as museums without walls. His take on portable museums was hardly revolutionary. The idea of a portable museum had at least been around since Duchamp in 1941, when he completed the first edition of Box in a Valise, which contained reproductions of his most famous works. Another portable museum from a few years later was one constructed by Joseph Cornell, simply called Museum, and it actually dealt with sound. The museum contained little containers, and visitors were asked to shake them and listen to them and see if they could determine what was inside of the little containers. And one of the containers allegedly only contained silence. Well, Malraux's idea to replace museums with books never really caught on, partially because of what Walter Benjamin would call the aura of authentic objects within museum spaces. So allegedly, people actually come to museums to be around real old things. But as time has progressed, this has even been changing. There are more and more object-free museums that are opening every year. One of the most recent and biggest examples is Brazil's Museum of Tomorrow, which is a museum that's dedicated to spreading the word about ecological sustainability. And it's a massive building filled with video projections, basically. So how does all of this fit together with my own work? I'm a sound artist and a PhD candidate, and my research project involves listening to the soundscapes of museums. I refer to this as a critical listening practice, so I spend time sound walking and field recording inside museums. And as a result of this practice, I make sound maps of museums. They're audio compositions that are constructed from the recordings that I make. And as I've made more and more of these museum sound maps, the methodology that I use has become more inclusive of my own sonic interventions with the space or the recordings, both during and after the field recording sessions. During this practice as well, I also make drawings of the sounds that I hear within museums. And to do this, I'm creating a symbology of the sounds that I hear within museums and use these symbols within the drawings that I make. So they're visual representations or icons of sounds, almost object-like. But what I keep thinking about as I continue this practice is whether museum soundscapes could ever become museological soundscapes. And what I mean by that is whether the soundscapes could actively support the museum's mission of engagement with their public through a conscious design of their soundscapes. The move toward the multisensory within museums has been gaining popularity a lot over the past decade. And finally, museologists are no longer afraid to admit that using senses other than sight are okay while engaging with museum objects. And as an example, here's a story from a book on the multisensory experience of museums. It says, curator and anthropologist Gloria Cranmer-Webster tells a story about an encounter she had with the Canadian anthropologist Wilson Duff in the early 1970s in the storeroom of the old University of British Columbia Museum of Anthropology. He picked up a raven rattle, she said, brought it over to me and asked, "Isn't it beautiful?" "Yes," I replied, and went back to my typewriter. He then asked, "But how do you read it?" Impatiently, I said, "Shit, Wilson, I don't read those things, I shake them." So people who work within museums are aware that they already collect objects that make sounds. But there's a fear around the subjectivity of the senses within academia and within museology. But these are also being argued against actively by museologists who claim that using a multisensory approach within museums is a way to better appreciate human imagination and experience, which is what museums are all about. And as it turns out, visitors to the earliest forms of what we would call the modern museum, wonder cameras and cabinets of curiosity, actually engaged with objects using all of their senses back in the 16th and 17th century. This was actually in agreement with the science of the time. And visitors were given private, hands-on tours of these places. Usually they were curated by rich men, and they were showing other rich men around. But they allowed these other rich men to touch, smell, listen, and even taste some of the objects on display. But when museums began opening to the public in the 18th century, that all changed, and museums became a strictly visual space. And apparently at the British Museum, you also couldn't give any money to servants. So in my practice, I began thinking about pushing this idea, about trying to relate what I do back to the origins of early museums, and wondering if there could ever be a museum that was only sound. To test this idea, I've opened my own museum called the Museum of Portable Sound. At the Museum of Portable Sound, we bring the culture of sound to the world one listener at a time. And this is very literal because the museum consists of audio files that are stored on this single mobile phone. And I carry it with me everywhere. Museum hours are by appointment or by bumping into me in the street, and you can arrange an appointment using a form on the museum's website, which is museumofportablesound.com. The museum opened in November of 2015 with a grand opening gala at the London College of Communication that also included a ribbon cutting ceremony. No audio files from the museum's collection are distributed over the internet. This is very important because we want to avoid any potential copyright violations. So visitors to the museum are met with by me, one-on-one, and they're provided with a PDF of the museum's gallery guide, which lays out the gallery structure, which is in place on the phone, and also includes things like object labels and other information. And that guide can be downloaded from the museum's website. The visitors are able to visit by themselves, or they can engage with me during their visit in a conversation. No matter what they do, we end up talking after they listen to it. There's about 30 minutes of material on the phone at any one time. Excuse me. So you might be wondering what's actually in the museum. Well, like I said, there are multiple themed galleries throughout the museum containing things like historical recordings. There's an excerpt from the first commercially released compact disc, an object that was donated by the British Library Sound Archive, is a digitization of the first commercially released recording of birdsong from Germany. There's also interface and mechanical sounds, so things like telephone booths or CD printers in offices. And then connecting to my interest in museum soundscapes, there are also galleries within the museum of museum soundscapes and exhibition sounds. Things like the National Pinball Hall of Fame and Museum in Las Vegas, or the slide projectors that were constantly running at the Anna Mendieta exhibition that was in London a couple of years ago. But really, getting back to what's in the museum, I would suggest that it's filled with sound objects. So what are those exactly? As I'm sure most of you or all of you are already aware, that term was originally coined by Pierre Schaeffer, the French modernist composer. Schaeffer's notion of the sound object was related to non-musical sounds recorded onto magnetic tape that could then be manipulated into music, forming what he called musique concrète. He described the sounds as acousmatic, which meant that their sources couldn't be seen, and that was a reference to the students of Pythagoras. Again, you probably all know this, but I feel the need to explain. He also believed that sound objects were possible because of what he referred to as reduced listening, which was the audible act of attending to the sound apart from its source. So Schaeffer was separating the sound from the physical object that made it. And while Schaeffer's ideas would go on to be extremely influential, nonetheless, the idea of sound as an object has been roundly criticized, most recently by Brian Kane, who will be giving a keynote here, and I'm very, very excited to hear him speak. And his major challenge to Schaeffer is what he calls the ontological problem of conceptualizing sounds as objects that reify sonic effects, rather than as events that bind source, cause, and effect together. But now, his ideas do seem like a bit of a stretch, obviously. Sound is not physical, so how could it be an object? But because I'm interested in museums and their relationships with objects, I've been wondering if there isn't some way that this actually does kind of make sense. And in my research, I've come across something that I do tend to agree with, which is Christoph Cox's notion of sonic materialism. And I have a quote here that's fairly lengthy, but I think it does need to be read in order to make this make sense. Cox said, "Visual objects survive the alteration of their properties. A door, for example, remains when it's painted a different color. By contrast, properties do not survive in this way. The redness of the door does not survive its repainting. In this respect, sounds appear to be much more akin to independently existing objects, since they survive changes to their qualities. A sound that begins as a low rumble may become a high-pitched whine while remaining a single sound. In such an occurrence, the object that produces it, a car for example, does not lose one sound and gain another. The sound remains what it is throughout, though its sensible qualities change. We can experience a sound without experiencing its source, and the source without the sound. So while sources generate or cause sounds, sounds are not bound to their sources as properties. Sounds then are distinct individuals or particulars like objects." So, quick quiz, what do museums collect? Anyone? Anyone? Correct. Very good. They collect objects. They also exhibit objects. They think through objects. Objects are the center of the museological universe. And as long as museum curators keep thinking sounds are not objects, they'll continue to mostly disregard the potential benefits of collecting and displaying sounds as objects within their galleries and within their soundscapes. So what I would like to do with this article, theoretically, is to attempt to remove the slightly dusty, shabby old sound object from experimental music and give it a shiny new life within the realm of museology. That's why I'm proposing a paleonomy of the sound object. Now, the term paleonomy is a term from Derrida, and according to him, a paleonomy is the maintenance of an old name in order to launch a new concept. And this idea has been used by other theorists, including the painter Gerhard Richter, who wrote about it in a book about thought images. And he described the paleonomic gesture as something that requires us to stand both inside and outside a tradition at the same time, perpetuating the tradition while breaking with it, and breaking with the tradition while perpetuating it. So I'm not saying I want to erase the history of Schaefer's sound object. I'm saying it would actually be nice if it could exist within museology as well and could really benefit that discipline. So I am, in a sense, disagreeing to agree with Schaefer in several ways. One is Cox's sonic materialism, which I already discussed. Also, something that I find very interesting is Schaefer's sound object was considered a conceptual space. And this is very similar to museologist Sandra Dudley's notion of museum objects. And she says that museum objects are actually a conceptual space between the visitor and the physical object itself. So there's a nice resonance there. Also, Nina Simon, another museologist, talks about things called social objects. And these are artifacts and experiences that can include things like a train whistle calling visitors to join a ride. I'm also interested in the burgeoning movement within sound studies towards a more anthropological attitude towards sound, where sounds can be considered an object of culture and human agency, very much like museum objects. So what I'm hoping a museological paleonomy of the sound object would include is it would represent collectible sonic events. Sound-making physical objects like antique cuckoo clocks, microwave ovens, seashells, archival audio recordings, sound art, installations, performances, other audible artifacts of intangible culture, as well as music and musical sounds. This would hopefully make all of sonic culture fully accessible to museology as a source of objects, while laying the groundwork to improve the design of museum soundscapes in order to better reflect the goals of museums themselves. So what I'm hoping is that through this redefinition, and the term may be entering into the larger discussions around curatorial activity within museology, is that museums might become more sensitive to the inclusion of sound objects within their displays and soundscapes. And I just want to end with a brief example from my field recording practice. Two recordings listened to side by side. The first is a recording of the flute display at the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford. And I'd like to compare that to a recording I made at the Art or Sound exhibition that was at the Fondazione Prada in Venice a couple of years ago. And what you'll hear at the end of this recording is the sound of what you're seeing in that picture, which is actually an antique cuckoo clock that's in the shape of a birdcage. So when I listen to recordings like this side by side, I start to think, well, which one of them actually sounds more like a museum? Could museums somehow sound even more like themselves? And what if museum soundscapes told stories the way that other museum objects do? That's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, John. Any questions? What's in it?
it's Thanks, John. I really enjoyed that. Having not heard you talk about this subject before, I immediately thought about the sound installations that are happening within museums already in the last 10 years, or the interactive elements. Have you sort of considered those within your research at this time, and how are you proposing they fit or don't fit within your concept?
I have thought about those a lot, actually, and I think a lot of the sound that you're hearing in museums tends to be illustrative or fanciful in a way. Things like a reconstructed soundscape from a medieval version of the city that you're in, or something that's used as a texture to complement what you're looking at, rather than the sound of something very literally that you're looking at. And I'm interested in the way museums tell stories with objects, and having those objects that do create sound actually not just being the silent objects that they have been in the past. And having sound be something that's more than just textural, something that actually helps tell the same story in a way that's not just sort of like wallpaper, which is what I tend to experience most sound that's in museums now as. Either that, or it's sound that accompanies something like a video, where what you're trying to learn from that video is a process that's being shown to you in the video, and it's something visual, and you're just hearing someone describe it, rather than rather than the sound itself being an integral part of that story.
Anyone else? Yeah. We are so lucky that we actually have Brian in here. So.
Thanks for this talk, and it's always it's a strange experience to see one's work being done. So, a comment and a question.
Okay.
The comment is that I don't think Cox is going to do what you want him to do. Christoph Cox is not interested in sound as objects, he's interested in sounds as events, and a good place to go would be this new book that came out on realism, materialism, and art that he edited. He has a little piece called Sonic Thoughts in there that makes this very, very clear. Mm-hmm. He likes the acousmatic reduction, he likes the idea of sounds being individuals or particulars, and he affirms Casey O'Callahan's book on sounds as an important source for this. But the actual notion of the object himself he thinks is overly visual, and it's undermined by his deep commitment to an ontology of flux and flow. So I don't think Cox is doing the work that you want him to do. Okay. Use the term sound object however you want. People have been using the term sound object however they want ever since Schaeffer and before Schaeffer. So you shouldn't feel any need to, I think, ground the work you're doing in Schaeffer. Use the term however you want. My question would be this. So Malraux's notion of the imaginary museum is a reference to Liszt's comment about there being an imaginary museum of musical works. Mm-hmm. So this notion of an imaginary museum has a kind of sonic dimension to it from the beginning. Wouldn't this be a kind of, here's my question, I guess, wouldn't this be a kind of more interesting tradition in which to think about the sonic museum rather than musique concrète and the sound object? Isn't there already a kind of longer museological reflection on sound that has been deeply connected with music and the concert hall?
I both agree and disagree. I think one of the reasons why I wanted to ground this within the realm of objects, other than the fact that, like I mentioned, museums do only think through objects. The object is king in museology. I didn't want to pursue the musical connection because I get nervous when we apply too many musical things in terms of sound to sound. I'm definitely not a cageist. I don't think that all sound is music. I think all music is sound. So I didn't really want to base this in something musical where you could go that route very easily. And I realize that grounding this in Schaefer is a little strange, and that's why that was the reason why I went towards the Paleonomy, of just taking it away from Schaefer and putting it into museology. And when I came across, I found the term in Richter's book on thought images, and it seemed very similar to what I was hoping to do with sound objects. And when I've seen sound objects being referred to in museological texts, like things like Noah Lobley from the Pitt Rivers has written about sound objects in his curatorial work there, he calls anything a sound object. And he calls any recording or anything, like he calls things like ethnographic field recordings. He refers to them as sound objects. Well, if a Schaeferian is reading that, they're going to completely not make sense of that. And I think even though people are starting to use that term within museology, I think within museology itself, it needs to be clarified. Otherwise, it will lead to confusion and just instant disagreement, and it's too much work. Because one of the things I love about museums is that they do have this very practical element where you can say all the theory you want in the world, but if it's not in the budget, they can't do it. And they will find excuses to not do things if they don't understand them. So if museums could start actually thinking about sounds as objects and looking through their collections and saying, hey, we have that clock, it makes a sound, that's another object, and adding another record to their database of the sound of that object, I think that might encourage them to start using sound more proactively rather than in the wallpaper sense that I was talking about earlier.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I think we will end now, and thank you
Okay.
very much, and thanks for the questions.